Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I call to order the special public meeting of the Cincinnati Public Schools for June 22nd, Cincinnati Public School Board for June 22nd, 2022. Ms. Wagner, would you please call the roll?
Ms. Bolton? Mr. Craig?
Here.
Ms. Jones? Here. Dr. Moffitt? Here. Mr. Morosky?
Here.
Mrs. Weinberg?
Here.
President Lindy?
Here. Thank you, everyone. We have just a single presentation today, and then a couple of votes on a superintendent's recommendation and treasurer's report, and then we're going to be recessing into executive session. My hope is probably in about a half hour from now. So welcome, everybody. Glad you're here. And we're going to turn it over to the superintendent and the treasurer for our presentation on the budget.
Actually, we're going to start off by inviting Ms. Char Jackson from the Cincinnati Preschool Promise. She was unable to attend the Finance Committee meeting, and so some questions about the CPP budget were submitted to her in writing, and she's here to answer them, so if all board members can hear it, and then we'll go on with the rest of our presentation.
Sounds great.
Turn your mic on.
Thanks, I appreciate it. And thank you so much for allowing me to attend this meeting to respond to questions. One of the questions we received is a brief explanation of why tuition assistance is up, quality improvement is down from the fiscal year 22 budget, and admin costs are up. Our priority is tuition assistance, of course, to make sure that children have access to those seats, and making our budget the fiscal year 23 projections are closer to the fiscal year 22 actuals when we look at numbers of serves and expenditures that are going to be made. It is an 11% increase, not year over year budget, but actual over budget. If you will see on the first page of the deck that we sent, it talks about the increase over actuals versus the budget. The second question is quality improvement going down for the budget. We have reduced some of the costs that we're doing in outdoor equipment expenditure, also in professional development, as more and more providers reach high quality.
Sure, if I can interrupt for 1 second. Does staff know, do we have a copy of the deck that she's referencing? It may have been emailed out. I just wasn't sure and thought I would just check real quick.
I can email it to you real quick.
That'd be great. Thank you very much.
And I think the high level numbers were shared at the last school board meeting when the overall preschool budget was presented. And I am talking about generalities about percentage increases, but to address the questions in general in terms of quality improvement, we know that many resources for quality improvement are coming, not only from state stabilization grants and ARPA funds, but from other resources as well. That's why we reduce some of our spending. And as more providers reach high quality, less funds need to be expended in that quality improvement space. It's what we always anticipated. And if you look at the original master agreement and how the expenditures worked, TA minimum dollars continue to grow, while QI dollars continue to decrease as we progressed, as more people reached high quality. In terms of the admin costs, the recommendation from our Board of Managers in December, after our review of our dashboard, our outcomes, our goals, as well as looking at the new strategic plan where the board convened in April to plan, is that we needed 3 additional dedicated positions. One is a deputy director to back me up. One is somebody that is devoted to quality improvement, that's an associate, to help make sure that we can do that with some efficiency now that we are spending less in terms of tangible equipment to make sure that they have the support they need. And another one is to make sure that our outreach and enrollment team that does direct communication with recruiting parents, as well as meeting with providers to get children enrolled, had the support that they needed on the ground. The next question was also related to fundraising. What efforts have we made in fundraising, and how is that impacting the last dollar in analysis? The fundraising that we have really focused on is to fill the gaps for things that cannot be used for public dollars and public resources. Two examples that I can give is one, $100,000 grant that we received from the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, specifically to help family child care providers do training and business development and business planning so that they could be effective businesses that were also educators. Another example would be the joint efforts that we've done with 4C, Learning Grove, and other entities to request $1 million in ARPA funding, specifically from the city of Cincinnati to address workforce issues and to address the challenges that we have with the talent pipeline and workforce. We will continue to do that, and one of the priorities that was set with the strategic plan by the board is to focus on diversifying our fundraising needs. And I'm happy to take any other questions that may be raised by that budget and hope that I was responsive to those questions that I did receive in writing.
Thank you very, very much, Sharon. Do board members have questions for the head of Preschool Promise? Dr. Moffat?
I do have a question for you. And I feel bad because I'm just now getting to look at the presentation, so please forgive my ignorance. You're increasing the staff by 3, but what are you going from into an increase of 3? I know you have you do a lot with a little already.
Sure. That is an 11% increase. So if we look at our budget on what that increase is, that includes not only those staff positions, but the cost of living increases as well. And the adjustment in that is approximately overall all staff related expenses increased by $337,000. Those 3 positions are just part of that, but you'll see details as well on the key changes for the forecast and the budget of all things that are included in that line item.
So how many staff do you have? Will you have with the additional 3?
We will have 9 FTEs.
And roughly how many do you service? How many providers do you service?
In our network, we have approximately about 214 providers that are at different stages of development. We probably have 160 that are on the moving to tuition assistance side. We also do some recruitment of new providers as well.
That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moffat. Other board members with questions? Ms. Bolden?
Yes, thank you for being here, and thanks for being specific about answering those questions that I think came out of Finance Committee. Appreciate it, and appreciate all the good work. I'd like to, if I could, we had a couple of things come up before the board recently, and you're probably very well aware about the Workforce Development Council. And in the original design, that is an entity that really reports directly to the school board more than anything. Could you tell us how in any way you use the Workforce Development Council, or if you do?
I think first the Workforce Development Council has really been used as a resource originally for professional development resources, and we have found that over time, having our team that does coaching as well as our provider council make recommendations directly to us of our professional development opportunities serves us in a little bit of a better way. I know that that council also did outreach to us, to teachers, and that would be very beneficial because we meet with providers, we meet with center owners and directors. We don't always have an opportunity to access teachers. Strategies that would help us develop that would be helpful. What we saw as kind of the best opportunity with the Workforce Development Council, because of all the workforce initiatives across the footprint, is if we had an entity of people like those that sit on the Workforce Council with expertise that helps us with the kindergarten transition, because that is where our greatest need is, to make connections with preschool teachers to make sure that the students that they have that are graduating, that are kindergarten ready, then have a direct connection and can move to a CPS kindergarten. That is what providers have asked us for, to someone to help them make that transition and understand that.
Thank you, Mr. President. To follow up on that, my understanding from the preschool folks, both CPS and Preschool Promise, that the Workforce Development Council is kind of moving towards being some sort of a working committee or it's kind of, I don't know if it's changing its purpose or if it's in some sort of transition. I wanted to get your assurance that you are interested in that, whatever transition for whatever destination. Well, we can't know what destination, but comfortable with the transition as we continue to move forward.
Yeah, I think we would always be open to that transition and how it serves as a resource. As again, understanding of what that workforce development committee is that it is truly a CPS committee. And CPP has devised some ways to help support that and do that outreach to teachers. That transition committee, we can share the strategies that would be most helpful. But again, as that committee transition, what providers have shared with us is that is the greatest need, to make sure that is a smooth transition, not solely a focus on workforce. As you know, there are probably 10 or 15 different initiatives in our community that are focused on workforce. So I think perhaps the transition to a work group to see what they can bring to the table would do that. But CPP does have a cost of quality committee that shares many of those same members that work together to talk about what those professional training and development, recruitment and retention strategies are as well.
That's very helpful. One last question, if I might. Both the CPS and the CPP folks, as we made that commitment to the voters, both the original and also in the renewal, that this would be last dollar in. There's been some reports that somehow maybe United Way or others might be diminishing or reducing, rightfully so, I'm sure, their profile. Could you tell us how successful you all have been, or your plans for making sure that you are pursuing the kinds of dollars that we as a public entity, so to speak, can't necessarily do? Because I know there's been some major millions of dollars released regarding workforce development. I don't know if it pertains at all to preschool or education, but if you could kind of brief us on that last dollar in that you play.
Sure. I think in terms of last dollar in, what we've seen is the resources that are available are those that are not designated for direct tuition for students. So the last dollar in would not come into play. We have seen places in which there are grant fundings or scholarships for classrooms, for large groups, but not for individual assistance to students to do tuition assistance. What we've seen in the case of many private providers is that when they go out and procure grants or other funding, they then are faced with making the choice of whether or not they want a preschool promise for some funding and support or other funding, because those combined together exceeds the amount for us to be last dollar in.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bolden. Other board members have questions? I want to try to get our treasurer up here in a second, our Sue. Okay, thank you very, very much. We appreciate it. And we'll invite Ms. Ragnar and Ms. Wright to share an update on the budget, the other parts of the budget.
Good afternoon. So we're going to tag team on this presentation, as we've started doing, and welcome to what feels like the 12th presentation on the budget. So we will go ahead and jump forward. Excuse me. As always, citing the board policy on equity and the equitable distribution of funds is what we tried to guide our way. Next slide. So the key messages for today is the superintendent's going to introduce her budget initiatives for next year, as well as things that are carrying over from prior administration and the strategic plan. You have in front of you, we're going to talk about the staffing changes, the school-based and central office, and you have detailed handouts. There's just too much data to put on a slide. So we'll walk you through that as well. We're going to show you some examples of how we tried to use the financial impact tool to make budget decisions. And then the superintendent's going to talk a little about the board and public feedback. And then we have a summary of the revised ESSER budget. So next slide. One more time. So the good news is we are under our budget target. In addition to all the budget reductions that we've shared with you in the past, I just want to spend a little bit of time on this slide. We've balanced the budget using what we have as recurring vacancy savings on our salaries. So pre-COVID, we tended to have around $9 million in salary savings every year based on just this rolling vacancy, trying to fill, people leave, come and go, hard to fill positions. Since COVID, we've grown that vacancy savings. In fact, fiscal year 22, we're going to see about a $24 million savings after the last payroll this week. So for next year, we're just making a conservative assumption that $13 million will be put towards the salary line items so that we won't be spending that money. And then the next line that shows an annual prior year encumbrance cancellation. So in September, by September 30th of each year, we have to file our final expenditure reports for all our state and federal grants. And when that process is over, we go out and say that any open purchase order from the prior year is now canceled, and that money reverts back to the cash balance. So pre-COVID, we were estimating averaging about $6.5 to $7 million a year. And the last couple of years, it's been more like 13 and almost 20 million. So very conservatively, we're going to use that 7.4 million to offset some of the increases in the budget that we've been trying to deal with. So just to kind of explain that, the left side of that chart, the top line, the school allocated, is the school budgets based on their projected students. So all the staffing is a formulaic based, then our non-personnel per pupil allocations, that equals $340 million. The next line are budgets, line items that are budgeted centrally, but they're allocated out to the schools based on a per pupil cost. And those things are transportation services, some technology expenses, and I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget. Oh, the Department of Student Services has about $30 million in that line item. IT is $23 million. Curriculum is about $14 million. So the line below that, the centrally allocated, are same thing, centrally budgeted, but they're allocated to the school and not to the student. And so those examples are the custodians. So custodians are budgeted by the facilities department, but they're actually working out into the buildings. And so we're trying to recognize that the cost of the schools is not 340 million, but 550 million. And then that leaves us with 52 million in central administration, 26 million in district fixed. And if you'll recall, district fixed is made up of our debt payment that goes from the general fund into the debt fund. The $3.4 million that we're required to transfer from the general fund into the facilities maintenance fund, and then our liability expenses. So as of yesterday, we were at 629 million, and then using those savings, we're down to 609. So the chart on the right-hand side shows you visually that over 88% of every dollar we spend is actually spent at the school site. 4% is for district fixed costs and 8% for central administration. Next slide. Here I'm going to turn it over to Superintendent Wright. She's going to talk about her priorities.
Thank you. So today we spent a full day in the first day of our Principals Academy. So really pretty excited about that. It was an amazing experience. But in terms of thinking about the strategic priorities, they really align with the things that we've talked to the board about before. One, academics, behavior, and culture, just to put those in the back to the basics, ABCs. So one of those is maintaining high quality curriculum. This year we did adopt science and world languages in terms of curriculum. This is the fourth in the adoption cycle. We did have the team to go back through and review as we've been going through the budget and reviewing each line item to make sure that we are able to offer the resources to the students, but we're not doing that in a way that it would be cost prohibitive. So we did maintain that as a priority. The other, over the last several years, the district has done a really good job of purchasing high quality materials. In the era of COVID and slightly before, there was not as much of an opportunity to provide high quality professional development to staff in order to effectively utilize those materials. So really wanting to make sure that over the course of the year, we're offering those professional learning opportunities. And that's also something that we've seen quite a bit in terms of feedback. As we've seen from all of the feedback that we have, as well as the feedback that we did on the budget, there's still very much an interest and a focus on mental health and how we're continuing to maintain our mental health initiatives. And coupled with mental health, positive behavior supports, as well as social emotional learning. So continuing to focus in those areas. In addition is a high school focus. We have high school, we know that, our high schools are in need of additional support. And so in walking schools and getting feedback from principals, and in looking at really the work that needs to happen in terms of high school. One of the spaces that really needs some additional support is really in the junior high school space. Our 7th and 8th grade students are in the high school buildings, and as you're walking with them and having conversation with the principals, there's need for additional support for them. So establishing a high school transformation office where that office really looks at the overall high school redesign, where we bring a plan to actually talk about that plan and what implementation looks like. And a part of that is giving some additional support specifically for the 7th and 8th grade level for high schools that would like to have that support for additional help with PBIS as well as social emotional learning and behavior and discipline support. And also making sure that we are continuing to elevate diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of operations. So one of the positions as a part of the organizational structure is not just the chief position in terms of operations, but also an instructional equity, senior director of instructional equity. So we're looking at all of those resources that students would have access to that are outside of English, math, science, and social studies. So as you're talking about ELL or world languages, art and music, making sure that there is that is being done with an equity lens in mind. As we go to the next, some of these are carryover items or carry forward items from our budget initiatives from previously. So from the previous administration, there was the focus on the first grade reading specialist that is currently funded in ESSER. That would be one of the areas that at the end of this year, we will be looking at the data around that to determine whether or not it's something that we look at continuing to recommend that we fund into the next ESSER cycle. Maintaining social workers in every building. Really loud feedback around, again, social emotional support, social emotional learning, PBIS, so maintaining that and still having a nurse right now in each of the schools. That is something we'll also be monitoring to have additional discussion about as we get to a point with COVID that appears to be more manageable right now. We also know from working with staff that we did have several vacancies in the school nurse role last year, so continuing to monitor that so that we're not continuing to carry vacancies or holding the budget because we're holding on to those vacancies. We did add previously there were additional counselors that were added specifically at the high school level to provide support to try to get closer to the national expectation for counselors in terms of student counselor ratio. We're off right now, but closer with the addition of the counselors. And last, the expansion of ELL learner teachers. So in terms of the ratio, we have added an additional 8 teachers for our ELL population. That is a growing population for us. And again, we want to make sure that we're getting as close to the anticipated and expected ratio for a teacher to students as possible. I think that was to the next one.
So what you have in front of you on the slide is a high-level summary of the school staffing, but you have a handout that actually shows you position by position. But in a nutshell, our classroom teacher positions were increased. And then we have reductions in some of the support areas and operations. And what I did on the right-hand side was to give you the major change, not every little change. But so for instructional support, some of it we reduced overload paras. It was all based on projected students, but there was also a change in the collective bargaining agreement in terms of the way the formula was calculated. So that was a reduction. We reduced super subs. If you recall, we added 163 super subs to the buildings to prevent viruses from carrying from building to building. And we were stepping that down each year to get back to a normal level. And so there was a reduction of 40 super subs. And so there's some other offsetting positions in there. And then under operations, there was 85 health and safety paras that we eliminated. We've added them because of because of COVID, because of the need for physical distancing and monitoring the halls and the buses and temperatures and masks. And those needs have gone away for the most part. And then we had some changes in administration. A couple of assistant principals were added due to enrollment growth and clerical. So next slide shows you the central office high level. It was hard to determine what to put on a slide from central office, but once again, you have a handout that shows you every position. There was a net reduction of 17 positions. They were almost all vacant. Otherwise, they're moving into other roles. What I do want to say is that the superintendent's reorg plan hasn't been fully implemented in the staffing numbers. They've been put into the dollar values, but until she goes public with her choices, I didn't want to get out in front of her publicly. So those, we will monitor that and update it for Monday night. Next slide. So superintendent's back up again.
Okay, so the financial impact tool is one that we spent a lot of time looking at and reviewing as we're bringing forward recommendations. So starting with the first, centralized enrollment, there was conversation about removing enrollment at each individual school site and bringing that down to the central office building so that all parents would need to come here in order to enroll their children. And so in looking at that $1.9 million, you know, there are other priorities in terms of access, making sure that parents have access to buildings versus trying to come here just to enroll. The other one was a $750,000 ask, which was renovation of the third floor. As we reviewed the tool, we really looked closely at impacts for children, and this one did not impact students at all. This was a reorganization of the third floor that would impact staff. It's not as if the third floor, we're using the third floor now, so it's not that it wasn't usable. Initial conversation was around additional spacing that may have been more necessary during higher COVID times. So no students were impacted there. In terms of the outdoor classrooms, $875,000 with about 6,800 students. And that is something that we really want to continue to look at and move forward with, but we want to merge it into the strategic plan so that it becomes overall a written plan for implementation for how that looks with rollout, and then collectively, not just what we're doing with the spaces, but how we make sure that it's integrated into the overall curriculum. ITM services and delivery. So during the initial COVID time, there was an increase with the amount of technology. There was an increase at the school sites with the service delivery model. So we were able to look at the service delivery model and recognize that we could save $1.1 million in that delivery model without having major impact to the response time for staff. And so that was another one of the areas from the impact tool.
559 was the cut. 1.1 is the new value.
I'm sorry. Okay. And next slide, Rob. And continuing, one of the areas we know that there was an overall cost and there's an increase from initially, but the ask for Walnut Hills for an additional building space. And the information that was provided to us was to reduce the number of teachers that were traveling. So essentially there are 18 traveling teachers that are in the buildings. We have about 14 additional schools that were not a part of the facilities master plan, where there is some additional work that needs to be done in those schools as well. So as we think about equity across the schools, that is one that we're recommending that we hold on at this time. The next is career coordinators. This is a position that just came about last school year, this current school year. So they've just really gotten started. And so that's a position that we're recommending that we look at under consideration to repurpose, to give schools the option around the dean position that we discussed earlier and having feedback from the principals. There are many of them that would find that role for the dean a little more beneficial for what they need to do in the buildings right now in terms of behavioral and discipline support. And the last was the attendance clerks, and this is an additional clerical position that's in buildings right now. It's an entry-level clerical position. In reviewing data with our staff, this is a position that had quite a bit of turnover because it's an entry-level position, and so as other clerical positions open in the district, this becomes one where our clerical are moved from those positions into other positions. So the purpose of these clericals was to schedule the attendance intervention team meetings. And so that would be something that would be routed back to the school for those meetings to be scheduled, while we're also working with staff to see what kind of technological advances we can do to offer some offset with this. Is it something that we can generate from the computer that we can send out versus having an individual having to write the letters to actually mail them out to families? Next slide. Okay. So I'll do it. So in terms of the vendor contracts, and we know that we have some contracts that are in the treasurer's report. However, we're looking at the financial impact logic across the board. So the cost, how many students we're serving, the cost per student, and adding a focus on the outcome measures. So what is the return on investment for the contracts that we're paying? We know that there are a lot of contracts that we're looking at, and prior to the submission to the treasurer's report, that will be something that we would review in advance. So that as we move forward, there are some contracts that we would not be looking to repeat. Some of them for recommendations for this year, we have reduced the cost within those contracts, the ask, because many of them were asking for additional costs, and at this time, there just wasn't the data to support recommending that we move forward. So on this is a slide that you've seen before. This came as feedback from the budget town halls. And the one thing that I will add here is, I don't think I need to remind anyone that I started on May 2nd. And so this engagement at this particular level, the budget town hall meetings were already scheduled when I came, and in having conversation about how we could capture actual hard data from families or from those that were completing the surveys. We had already put out the survey of my entry that on May the 2nd. And so at that time, we added to the survey questions around the budget. Prior to then, there was not just one way codified that we could collect responses. Now there's qualitative information that's been given out or provided, or our constituents of the board may have reached out on different areas. But in terms of a hard factual way for us to say this is the feedback that we've gotten, we started that on the 3rd. So with those two sessions, the surveys were open the entire from the 3rd through the first Friday in June. Those surveys were open. And the town halls were on May the 3rd and May the 31st. The slide that you have gives you the feedback that we received on the surveys. And it was just pretty generic in terms of if you would like to give feedback about the budget, this is an opportunity to give feedback, and how would you prioritize these things? So that's what you get in terms of the actual slide. And you see kind of how it worked out in terms of the slide. That's also why it's important that we look at the financial impact tool to help inform the decision, but it's not the only thing that makes the decision, because there are other factors that we need to consider. And from the responses from the 100-day plan, we have actually 1,111 responses from the plan. And essentially, the conversation has been pretty consistent through that plan. We have a team that went through the plan and then gave some additional recommendations based on the feedback that was provided, a cross-section of a team across the district that's done that. And what we see in this bulleted form at a very high level is that currently we have initiative overload. We're in initiative fatigue. And so one of the things is really auditing the current initiatives that we're doing, connecting those things that we believe are important to a form of a strategic plan as we're beginning to go through that process, and then doing implementation plans around those so that it doesn't become, we're rolling this out at this time. Focus on academics. This specific was in the feedback, was the focus on academics before athletics and extracurriculars. We know that there's an opportunity for us to do them simultaneously, but essentially the hard information from the feedback said that. Equitable programming across schools, as well as continued strong support for mental health. And next slide, Rob.
So on the screen is a very high-level summary of the ESSER 3 grant. If you recall, we were allocated almost $209 million, and we can spend it until September 2024. So the original column represents what the board adopted in August of 2021 as part of that 3-year plan, and the current column represents where we're sitting today in terms of our estimated costs. We haven't finished closing the books for this year, so that $33 million will change based on what didn't get spent. And then that money will get allocated to the other years. You have a document in your hand that shows you the line-by-line changes for both fiscal year 22, fiscal year 23, and 24. And so I can certainly answer any questions about that, but like I said, it was just too much data to put in a slide. So We still have a contingency line of unallocated monies. We started with 6 million and now we're 6.5 million or more. And that will grow unless we come up with some new initiatives once we close fiscal year 22 and reallocate the unspent cash. So I believe that was the last slide. Yes. So we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. The plan
to the superintendent on page 6 on the proactive vendor contract review. I have always had an interest in figuring out or really better understanding how we measure success of our vendors. That's important because anybody can come in and say, we provide a good service, and I promise you they can bring you data that says that they're good. But how are we measuring the value in alignment with our strategic priorities?
Thank you very much. So as we're starting the process, I think one of the areas that's a growth area for us as a district is our access to data. And how we're actually using that data. So collectively, if all things are aligned in the direction that we expect for them to be aligned, everything would line up so that we're seeing improved academic outcomes for children as well. And right now, we're not in a position where we can cross-reference that data to say that we're seeing improved outcomes in terms of attendance, improved outcomes in terms of behavior, depending on what the area of the focus is for the contract, an improved outcome in overall academic performance. So forecasting moving forward, where I see us being able to do that, is looking at the students that we are working with within our contracts, not just the data that's provided by the provider, but from the internal data that we have, what has been the impact to our children in terms of their academic performance, in terms of their attendance, and in terms of their overall behavior.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Jones. Other board members with questions or comments? Dr. Moffitt?
I'll go. I appreciate the work that you two have done to put this together. I'm a little... when we don't see it ahead of time, I'm a little nervous because I have lots of questions, and I'll definitely shoot those out via email. As you all know, we spent a significant amount of time, hopefully the public does too, in governance training. And as a board, I think one of the things that we were charged with is establishing goals for the board that will be in alignment with the goals of the superintendent and the priorities of the superintendent. I'm a little concerned because we haven't done that part of it as a board, right, to have board goals. And just for the community's knowledge, our board goals should align with what the community goals are. So the community should tell us what you all want, and then we as a board, in collaboration with the community, establish goals, and then we align that with what the superintendent has established. And we just haven't done enough of that. To me, 1,100 responses out of 3,600 families is just not enough, or students, it's just not enough to me to have established succinct priorities for us to work on for next year. So I don't know how quickly we can do that, but I would challenge the superintendent to collect more data in collaboration with us as a board to establish what the community really wants more widely before we start saying that these are the only priorities or these are the main priorities that we have. That's my first concern. I have some more, but let me ask just another question just for clarification. The financial impact tool that starts on page 9, all of those are cuts. Is that correct? Okay, so we're cutting outdoor classrooms. The recommendation is that we cut that by $875,000. I guess I just wanted to understand how we're cutting that. We're cutting career coordinators. We're cutting attendance clerks. I think I probably just need to sit with it a little bit more. And this is what happens when I just see it for the first time along with the public. But I'm just concerned that we're going to cut 85 paras. Is that what I heard? We're going to cut staff that potentially directly impact our kids and programming that I think potentially impacts our kids. And we haven't established that that's a community priority. Am I understanding that right?
So the paras that were cut, the health and safety paras, were added because of COVID. Mm-hmm. Because they had to monitor and do temperatures and hallways and monitor buses and stuff like that. Schools needed extra help to comply with COVID restrictions and guidance. We're not under that guidance anymore, and so most of those positions are where there were a ton of vacancies, and so they were hard to fill anyway. And so we removed those because we're not under those same COVID guidelines.
Okay.
And so instructionally, they weren't cut.
Okay. So
the other thing that I'll add, Dr. Moffitt, is so just for, again, and I definitely concur with you, and we're going through the training together. However, we have a budget that we were asked to bring. When we started the process, we were $56 million in deficit when I came in on May the 2nd, when we started working together through the budget. So in terms of these priorities, these are priorities right now based on what we have in the budget and how those recommendations were made. This is not to imply that as a board, we have determined through our process going to the community. I know 1,100 is not enough responses.
No, it's not.
But I walked into none. So in terms of where we are right now, that's what we have. And these recommendations are best recommendations to the board. If the board is not in support of that, of course, then we're open to what the other recommendations are instead. But as we were looking at balancing the budget, we reviewed the information in terms of these strategic initiatives and initiatives that had already started, that had been provided previous to me coming to the organization, and then looking at the impact tool to give you the board collectively a balanced budget. If there's anything that we're not in agreement with, I definitely think that that's something that we work through. We talk about it, but at this point it becomes what do we take out to then add something else in, mm-hmm. or what do we add in to then take something else out?
Well, I think I guess I'll sum up my commentary to just say that we've collected data before you got here. Okay. So even at a very minimum, that data should be, it's from the community. So that data should be looked at too. And I just want to make sure that if the community tells us that something is important, that it's been captured and not we're just trying to rush to balance a budget and we've come up with priorities, that we understand what those priorities are from the community too. So those are just my questions. Right now, I'll definitely send my email, but thank you for all the work that you all have done. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Moffitt. Other board members, Mrs. Weinberg.
Yes, I just have one quick question, and I too will be sending some additional questions through email. But if you turn to page 6, where I think the slide is really 11, I know you mentioned that some contracts will not be renewed. Are you able to share the number of contracts that will not be renewed?
No, we don't have a number at this point because as they're being presented, so we try to look at the current contracts that we had this year, but they're not necessarily all renewing. So we ended up spinning our wheels on that. So as contracts are being presented to renew for next year is when we're determining whether they're going to meet the outcomes and the measures and whether it's part of the funding priority.
Were others too, Mrs. Weinberg, or was that the only one? Good. Other board members? Ms. Bolden?
Yeah, to that point, if we don't know which contracts are going to be renewed or not renewed, well, how are we supposed to vote next week. How are we supposed to vote? I mean, the contract piece, and I applaud the treasurer, and I know that the superintendent feels the same way, that there are so many, hundreds of contracts that we have both at the school level and the district level that really need to be reviewed. I mean, tonight we're going to vote for $440-some thousand for CYC. And nobody's been able to justify that for me for 3 years. And yet we're going to have a contract that might be for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or whatever. And we can't, part of the kids that they're helping are the kids outside our own district. So the contract piece, I'm so glad that Member Weinberg brought that up. And I'm so glad that we're using the financial outcome tool or whatever it's called to look at those. We need to do that. And the biggest problems with those contracts, I think, actually is at the schools. I think those are hard. Many of them, I would bet, majority of them are impossible to justify, and there are hundreds.
So, Board Member Bolton, thank you very much. So, as our treasurer shared, we started with the contracts from this year. In looking at and reviewing those contracts, many of those contracts. So right now, where we are in terms of balancing is balanced with the information that we have for the current contracts, which includes those that are on the treasurer's report. So one of the examples that you gave, for example, was CYC. And the information that's been provided back to us from that particular organization, there was a request to increase the contract, which we did not request. But we did believe that we needed this school year to collect the additional information and the data so that we were making the decision that was the best decision moving forward. And so as our treasurer is sharing in terms of the contracts, most of the contract challenges, as you know as well, are at the school level. And so we've talked about for moving forward, once we determine what those overall priorities are, collectively as a board, making sure that we begin the process at that time to bucket out those priorities and then look at those vendors based on the services that schools would be provided. We thought that it would be disruptive at this point as schools have already started with their processes and are just waiting for an approved budget to move forward. We thought it would be disruptive to say to them, with principals leaving next week, we thought it would be disruptive to say to them that this is what you've already put in, this is what your budget supports at this point, and you're not going to be able to move forward with that. Instead, we thought that it would be most prudent to determine the priorities, determine the areas that we're looking at. As we disaggregate the contracts, most of them are for academic support, they are for mentoring, and they're for data coaching. So we can look at those 3 buckets to start with, but disaggregating those and then looking at from there, who are those vendors, because a lot of the contracts, they go outside of our overall processes because they're done at the school level and we don't have one way to review it. So that was our recommendation as we moved through it, the best way to kind of move forward. But just to that specific one that you did recommend, it's not one that, as we reviewed, that we were looking to increase what they were doing for last year.
If I could follow up on that, then it would be my hope, since we're in a transition period, then that none of these particular contracts are longer than a year.
Support.
None of
The
them.
ones that are in under award of contracts, the RFP, the bid tabulation, some of them say 3 years.
Yes, they do. And the other piece of that is traditionally we've done some 5-year contracts that I know we've regretted greatly. So I think maybe part of the answer on the contract piece, to follow up on Member Weinberg's point, might be just the length issue. Because if we're actually in a transition period and a serious review of very focused accountability, 1 year should be it. And I know that costs us more money for a year, because the longer the contract, generally it's a cheaper contract for some obvious reasons, because they have stability, we have stability. But I would certainly encourage that there be for 1 year. And if indeed we're pursuing these, I won't be voting for CYC, because we've asked 3 years in a row for information about CYC, and it's a historically significant entity that has done great things for us, but in the last years, it has not. Of course, to follow up on Dr. Moffat's point, if I could, I do think there's an interest in the connection between whatever the board goals are, and we did spend 2 days together and didn't come up with any goals, which is unfortunate, but I appreciate your goals that you've listed here. I think we all agree that these are good and of high priority, but looking at those goals, and you won't be surprised what I'm about to say, I think any one of those goals or all of those goals speak to the outdoor program. Every single one of them speaks to the outdoor program, and I honestly think it's a betrayal of the community's work for 3 years to say, we're gonna, and I'm really pleased that Dr. Moffat mentioned that financial impact tool really reads CUT. And we need to list it that way and for full transparency, because this is the $875,000. I don't know which part of it's curriculum, and I don't know which part of it is the $180,000 of facilities. The reality is we made a promise last year and the administration didn't develop and deliver on it. And these folks, 30 some different nonprofits have been working hard and doing all kinds of stuff. And I feel very strongly that at least for as one board, I want to see that returned. And I'm happy to give you a couple other ideas what to cut instead of that, because that's directly impacting on the children. It is for the future, and it's connecting us with the city, with the county, and it is the future. So I would make some comment there. I'm worried. I like most of this stuff, and I trust you. I wouldn't have voted for you if I didn't think I could trust you. But I think one of the things that I want to see here is I'm worried about that somehow somebody believes there's too much focus, too much focus on athletics and extracurriculars. I don't believe that is possible in an urban community, to not be focusing on extracurriculars. And I do think we failed miserably on academics, and that's another reason you're here. But athletics and extracurriculars, I think, are at the heart of it, which goes also to the field trip piece and, the four-wheel buses and what have you. But that concerns me as you all review this, because I'm going to assume that we still have something to say about this. The last thing I worry that we're going to have a dean about 7th and 8th grade. We need it because that's another promise we did not keep to the public. When we moved from the K-8 model to the K-6, 7-12, we promised, and that goes all the way back to the Rona administration, that we would be able, and I think we've talked a little bit about that, we promised those families and those kids that there would be some concerted effort about 7th and 8th grade, and that they'd be separated. They were not good to have them with the little people, and we already had junior highs that failed miserably years and years ago, but we didn't do what we needed to do. I'm just worried, this dean thing, I think part of that would be to really be focusing on maybe some more K-8s, or I would be hoping that we would be focusing too on making sure our high schools are more accommodating to our 7th and 8th, because that's where the dropout's happening.
Yes.
So those would be some of my comments. But my number one comment is, if I'm going by your priorities, outdoor needs to be returned. And I think you're going to be hearing about it. So I feel strongly about that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Bolden. I want to get every board member in, but I do want to see anything from Ms. Ryder, Ms. Wagner, to Ms. Bolden's questions.
Okay. I would say thank you for the feedback. not surprised by your feedback at all in terms of the conversation. I would say in terms of thinking about, I don't think that we should think about the outdoor classroom, for example, as a not. I think that we should think about it as a hold for now, so that it becomes a part of a larger conversation. For example, we've had conversation, Board Member Moffitt and I, with around the conversation with teams, and one of those was one of the representatives, I think, from the organization that you're referencing right now, around a larger conversation around energy conservation across the board. One of the things that is the concern at this point is what is our overall long-term plan for whatever the initiative is. And so as we're talking about energy conservation, as we're talking about renewable resources, as we're talking about expanding opportunities for children outside of the classroom, how do we then do that and build it into an overall plan that becomes sustainable? So again, it's at the will of the board in terms of what we do next and how we do that work, but that is in terms of that response, that would be one that I would provide for that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Superintendent. All right, I do want to get Mr. Morosky a chance here so we can hear from everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Lindy. So I have two, but one has been largely covered, and it was the outdoor classroom piece. I would love to see on Monday, and Ms. Bolton sort of addressed this, I'm just going to say it a different way. If I could see, I don't know what that $875,000 means. I don't know what that, to your point, if I could see what that means, I will also argue and fight to keep that in there, but if I'm able to see line by line, there might be a way, maybe we could put that on hold or this on hold. And I'm glad you said what you said too, so I want to put a pin in the piece about the plan. I think that's amazing. We often, in any government, not just here, do things because either they feel good or are responding to stuff with no actual what is the end goal, so I think that's awesome. I would contend that putting on a program that the community loves on hold to do that is maybe not the wisest. I think we could probably do both at the same time. And again, maybe it's not all 875, but I don't know because I don't know what it looks like. So I would just request that if I could. And then second, I would love to know if so the attendance clerk piece, we made a huge investment in our social workers as a board. We were proud of that. We had students come here from Woodward High School. People will remember pre-COVID. We did an investment then. We did another one and another one and another one. The attendance clerks did a lot of that clerical work that social workers were doing. Is there a concern? I think I might have one, but I'm curious if there is a concern getting rid of them if that work then falls back on the work of our social workers. Because if so, to echo Ms. Bolton regarding this bucket, I would be more than happy to help find places we could trim some things to keep those clerks.
Yes. So in terms of conversation with staff, one of the areas, so essentially right now that process is all manual. It's a manual process where you actually have staff that are writing the letters, looking at the reports, writing the letters and sending them out. There is an opportunity through our student information system to set up systems so that when students are absent, there are a certain number of days that you get an auto-generated letter that is still mailed out from the school, but not necessarily from one individual person. The other thing that's also important about this role is this is not, while it's a change of the position, because we have clerical vacancies, it doesn't change the personnel. So many of these positions remained vacant for a period of time because it was an entry-level position. And so it was a revolving door in terms of getting staff ready. Now, again, at the will of the board, if there is something else that is recommended that we do instead, we can definitely take a look at that because by all means, you all have control of that part of it. But that was the background thinking on it. You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Morosky. Did Mr. Craig have anything?
So I just will say this. I think what you guys presented is really helpful for us to understand where you're looking and where you're moving towards. I think one of the things that has been a hard conversation to have at times is that we do have a number of vacancies in positions that, at times we're trying to keep or at times we're trying to figure out how to deal with. But the reality is if there's not going to be somebody in that position long-term, similar to what you were just discussing with the attendance clerk's position, if we're not going to have somebody continuously in that and we're going to be doing that work anyway outside of it, what's the value to reviewing those types of things? And I think that's helpful to have that communication with you guys as we build the budget. And so I appreciate that effort. I think we had similar conversations about some roles last board meeting as well, and at the budget and finance meeting about roles where we don't have people in or where we're not using those positions in the correct way. I mean, that shows to our community that we're actually thinking about how we're spending your dollars. We're actually paying attention to some of those personnel decisions. I think the larger question is going to still be there for folks to review is just whether or not the priorities from which you have set align with the priorities for which the board then has to make a decision. And so I think that's just on us to give our feedback and our opinions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Craig. I want to close by sharing just a couple things here, and then I think we will recess into executive session because we have a couple things to discuss, and we're going to get people out of here at 5:30. I wanted to say, I think a heavy dose of gratitude. I think doing a project at this scale, of this complexity, on this kind of timeline is incredibly challenging. And I think there are a lot of things coming through the emerging recommendation that I think are really important. I think it's really important that it be financially balanced as we look across our 5-year forecast. I think that's outstanding. I think there's more rigor around return on investment for children than I've seen in past budget discussions. And I think that's a great step in the right direction, and I really appreciate that. I also think in the governance training has come up in a couple different contexts. Ms. Bolden said, I think we spent 2 days in that room and we didn't have any goals by the end. I think that we're going to be in this space for a minute where we're both having to execute a current year with a current set of constraints and realities while we're also trying to build and set something up for the future. And that's just going to take some time. And I think that over that transition period, we'll see our community engagement get better. We'll see the types of goals we set as a district improve. We'll see the way we think about budgets improve and evaluations improve. But there's going to be this middle space where we're coming off of a way we have done things, but we're not to the future state yet. And I think in many, many different ways, this just feels like a really strong example of what that looks like when done well. So I just close by saying I think these decisions are always really, really difficult and really hard. I trust our new administration. I think you got a great sense of where people are and the kinds of questions they have. We don't have a ton of time, but we have a little bit of time to make sure that we could get all those questions vetted. And I appreciate it.
Mr. President, I know you want to close, but I'm going to say.
I do want to close. Yes, Ms. Bolden.
Too bad. The issue here for the superintendent and the treasurer's own sake, while they do not have new goals from us, which is the justification for what they are envisioning and what they want to implement, they have to be working from that set of goals that are already in place. And those sets of goals that are already in place, I think will serve them well and are very much involved. And besides the 3 years of strategic planning that is concluding, besides even those goals, going back more than 3 years, the goals that exist that were adopted, and this is over at least 4 iterations of boards, would be good guideposts that I think that the administration will want to, and interrelating that, because you don't want our administration out there in the hinterland coming up with something.
I appreciate the feedback and the perspective, and it's important. And we have a superintendent's recs and a treasurer's report, and one of the things we're going to talk about in a minute, I think will address many of your concerns. But I want to keep us moving in that direction. So do we have I think we have the superintendent's recommendations, and I think we have maybe one retirement this evening to announce. If Mrs. Weinberg would like to share the retirement.
All right. Yes, we have one retirement today. It's for civil service personnel. Rhonda Waggers, Assistant Supervisor in Dining Services. We want to wish her well and thank her for her service for the Cincinnati Public School District and for the students, and we wish her all the best in her future endeavors.
Great. Thank you, Mrs. Weinberg. Do we have a motion to approve the recommendations from the superintendent this afternoon?
So moved.
I was just going to say, can you give a moment, because people didn't get the physical copy of it, they got it on email. So just give a moment for the board members to pull it
Yeah,
up.
do people need a second to review it?
Just
I got it.
When was it sent? Around what time?
Approximately.
Because I didn't see it. And I'm still, who did it come from? Did it come from
So I will,
Phyllis? I don't know who it came from.
Let me follow up with staff because I was under the impression that you received it.
It was on the 21st, so it was yesterday.
So
Yesterday?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm finding it.
I'm just going to say publicly, because I've said this before, just give a minute. It doesn't, I'm here. I do not want things to be prolonged, but I don't want to feel rushed. A couple of seconds just is fine. Just give a couple of seconds.
So if people are looking for it, it is posted on board docs.
I'm good.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Jones. So is there a motion to approve the superintendent's recommendations?
So moved.
Thank you, Brandon. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Moffat. Any discussion? Ms. Wagner?
Ms. Bolton?
Yes, on everything, but I will abstain on E.
I'm sorry, did you say
First,
D?
D.
D as in
as
dog?
in dog, because
Okay.
I have two of them. And I think it's the first item on D.
Mr. Craig?
Yes.
Ms. Jones?
I recuse vote on item E and certified, and yes on everything else.
Of course. See, this is what happens with outdoor eds. What happens?
Dr. Moffat?
Yes.
Mr. Morosky?
Yes.
Mrs. Weinberg?
Yes.
President Lindy?
Yes. Do we have a motion to approve the report of the treasurer?
So moved.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Craig. Any discussion on the report of the treasurer?
I would just like to draw
Ms.
attention.
Bolton, yes.
Thank you, I'm sorry. I would just like to draw attention to the fact that some of these are for the next year. And I think that's great, that's good, but members should be cognizant of the fact. And I think it would be helpful too, as we go forward, to actually know the length of these contracts that we are, I mean, we're talking about dates, you know, June 22 to June 23, but for these contracts, how long are they actually? That would be a great reporting thing, and maybe they are, but I've missed it.
So I was going to point out that in the first 9 agreements, they're all for fiscal year 23. We started, you know, instead of you doing 300 contracts on June 27th, or whatever Monday's date is. So those first 9 are, and then we will make sure that the multi-year contracts are noted in the future.
President, so the ones we're voting on tonight that are for the future are only 1 year.
I didn't say that.
First
Okay,
9.
okay.
So there's the first 9 in here under the agreements are for next year. And they appear to be annual contracts. The ProSource contract, the first one on there, is a multi-year contract. I don't know where we are in that, but in reports going forward, we'll make sure that you know that on the document. The ones for that are awards of contracts for the RFPs, there is one that's a multi-year contract. Well, several are 3-year contracts. One is 1 year.
Thank you, Ms. Wagner. Other discussion, questions? Dr. Moffat?
Are we able to differentiate that in the reporting, maybe moving
Yes.
forward? So
Yes.
that like 1 asterisk is 1 year, 2 asterisks is 2. And then my question is for both of you, who owns the data that these contractors? So if you're at a school and you do this wonderful programming at Woodward, for example, do we own that data so that we can collect the data to see trends and we can analyze it, or does the school own it? Does the district own it? Does the organization own it?
right now, Dr. Moffat, from information that I've been able to review, all of it's come to us from vendors if there is data. So that's not to say that there is not data that's available at schools, but it's not in a format that has been trackable across the board at this point. So vision moving forward, one of the things that we've discussed in terms of even the conversations around reorg is a contract analyst, contract specialist, that a part of their responsibility is to do two things. One is to make sure that the deliverables are in the contract in terms of what we're expecting as ROI, as return on investment from the contract. The second is to be a repository for collecting the data, so that it is data, even if the organization is providing data, we have a way as an organization to cross-reference that data based on those three different metrics, because those are the metrics that, depending on what the organization is, another metrics might be credit attainment. So if you have an organization that's working with our high schools around credit attainment, but really it's around academic performance, attendance, and discipline generally.
And my last question is, do we utilize some of the, I don't think it's data collection, but like the University of Cincinnati, Xavier, Cincinnati State, they have departments that collect data for us. Do we utilize them in those ways with our contractors, and is there any connectivity to have uniformity across our data?
There has been some conversation that was started within the organization through our research and evaluation team, but it's just starting. So in terms of working, like, for example, with the Children's Home, for example, or Cincinnati Children's, they would enter into an agreement with us, a request to do evaluation with our students, and then data would be provided to them that they would triangulate with the data that they have. So that goes through research and evaluation in terms of approval processes. On the inside of that, however, there has not been one systematic way that we're collecting data in the district, or have a data platform that we're collecting data in the district, that we can then work with our individual vendors to pull their data, cross-reference their students, and then be able to say these are the students that they were impacting, and this is the data that comes from that. Work in progress, though.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Any last questions? Ms. Wagner, would you please call the roll?
Bolton?
Yes, but no on the CYC contract, which I believe is Roman numeral 4A.
Mr. Craig?
Yes.
Ms. Jones?
Yes.
Dr. Moffitt?
Yes.
Mr. Morosky?
Yes.
Mrs. Weinberg?
Yes.
President Lindy?
Yes. Thank you. We're going to adjourn this section of the meeting, and at 5:15 in room 110, we're going to reopen with a motion for executive session. So we're going to end at 5:30, team. So we're going to start real quick, probably have one topic, and then hit the road. Thank you.